Flights in and out of airports in Tel Aviv, Dubai, Doha and other international hubs in the region have been suspended.
But with reports that we've been tracking for the last few hours of a drone striking the Dubai International Airport's runway, forcing the suspension of all flights today.
Dubai built the most connected airport on Earth, 160 destinations, 260 airlines. A hub engineered so precisely that a bag checked in Lagos could make a connection in Dubai and land in Vancouver without a single human touching it twice. The entire system was a miracle of logistics, and then the entire system became the problem. Because when you build a city around the concept of frictionless movement, you have also built a city with no plan for when the movement stops. And in March 2026, the movement stopped. Not gradually, not with warning. The kind of stop that happens when a system optimized entirely for speed and volume encounters something it was never designed to absorb. Within 72 hours of the security incident at Terminal 3 on March 1st, more than 3,000 flights had been canceled. Not delayed, canceled. The cancellation rate at Dubai International climbed to figures that the airport's own operational models had never stress-tested, because nobody stress-tested for this. The assumption, built into every projection and every expansion plan, was that the hub would always be a hub, that the connections would always connect, that the movement would always move. This video is about what happens when that assumption breaks, not just to an airport, to the hundreds of thousands of people who were inside the system when it stopped, and to the city that built its entire identity around the promise that it never would. Dubai's proposition was always elegant in its simplicity. The world is large and inconveniently arranged. Fly through us and we will make it smaller. The Emirates airline did not just build routes, it built a geometry of global travel with Dubai at the center of every line. By 2024, Dubai International Airport was processing 95.2 million passengers annually, a number that represented not just traffic volume, but a philosophy. The philosophy that connectivity itself is a product, that you can sell the act of passing through a place as reliably as you can sell anything made in a factory. For 2 decades, it worked. The airport fed the hotels fed the restaurants fed the retail fed the real estate, and the real estate fed the government's vision of a city that would never need oil again because it had something more renewable. It had throughput. It had the perpetual motion of people and capital moving through a geographic bottleneck that Dubai had turned into the most valuable real estate on the planet's flight map. The Mercer Cost of Living Index had been flagging the underlying tension for years. Dubai's cost base had been rising faster than the value it delivered to the mid-tier traveler and the mid-level expatriate professional. Knight Frank's 2024 Wealth Report documented a 40% increase in residential rents over the preceding 2 years. The Cooper Fitch Salary Guide for the Gulf region showed real wage growth in most professional sectors running at roughly half the rate of inflation. These were not catastrophic numbers in isolation. But they were numbers that described a city quietly pricing out the demographic that sustained its operational reality while loudly courting the demographic that generated its promotional imagery. The ultra-wealthy were fine. They are always fine. For the family office client flying in on a private charter to close a transaction at the Dubai International Financial Center, none of these numbers registered as friction. But the mid-tier tourist, the one who had saved carefully for the Atlantis experience, who had budgeted the trip to work at the exchange rates of 18 months ago, was already arriving in a city that cost more than the brochure had implied. And the mid-level expatriate professional, the one running the compliance department of a regional bank or managing the logistics of a European retail brand's Gulf operations, was already doing the math on whether the tax advantage still covered the gap between their salary and what it actually cost to live here decently. These fractures were invisible from the outside because the occupancy numbers stayed high and the passenger counts kept breaking records. But they were there. Here is where the numbers get specific, and specific is what matters. In the first 3 weeks of March 2026, data compiled from airline operational reports indicates that more than 37,000 flights were affected at Dubai International through cancellations, indefinite holds, or unscheduled diversions. British Airways suspended operations. Virgin Atlantic followed. The cost of risk insurance for routes through Gulf airspace had spiked to levels that made the economics of operating those routes temporarily indefensible for carriers already managing thin margins. The ripple effect reached airports that had no direct connection to the incident. Connecting passengers who had already left their origin cities and were mid-journey found themselves in a transit system that had stopped transiting. Smith Travel Research, which tracks hotel performance data across global markets, estimated that Dubai's average daily room rate collapsed by more than 30% in the first 2 weeks of March, as properties desperate to generate any cash flow began discounting at levels not seen since the contraction of 2020. Occupancy, to which the Dubai Department of Economy and Tourism had reported at 82% for the fourth quarter of 2025, fell below 20% within days. That is not a market correction. That is a market in clinical suspension. And then there were the people who simply could not leave. The stranded passenger is a category that airline systems are designed to minimize and tourist boards are designed to never discuss publicly. But in March 2026, the category became a mass phenomenon. Families with connecting itineraries who had no legal right to enter the United Arab Emirates and therefore could not leave the transit zone, which had become, in practical terms, an overflow facility operating at multiples of its designed capacity. Tourists whose return flights had been canceled unilaterally by carriers invoking force majeure clauses buried in conditions of carriage that nobody reads until they need to. Business travelers whose corporate travel policies had no protocol for a scenario in which the entire hub stops functioning simultaneously. The Fairmont on Palm Jumeirah reported that a significant portion of its occupied rooms in the first week of March were guests who could not check out because they had nowhere to go. Their flights did not exist anymore. The hotel became involuntarily something between a luxury holding facility and a very expensive waiting room. The guests had the pools and the restaurants and the beach. They did not have a departure date. For the upper tier of stranded travelers, the response was financial. Here, the market for private jet charters out of Al Maktoum International, the secondary airport that remained partially operational, saw demand surge to levels that pushed charter prices to figures that would have seemed implausible weeks earlier. Those who could pay, paid. Those who could not, waited. That gap between the traveler who could spend their way out of a systemic failure and the traveler who could not is the gap that Dubai's promotional narrative had always been careful to obscure. The mid-tier tourist, the couple from Manchester or the family from Toronto, or the solo traveler from Seoul who had booked the trip through a package operator and paid for travel insurance that turned out to contain exclusions they had not noticed. And these were the people sitting on terminal floors with their luggage stacked around them like small fortifications. Their insurance was calling the situation an extraordinary event. Their airline was directing them to a website that crashed under load. Their hotel was telling them that technically their booking had expired and technically they would need to pay for additional nights at the current rate, which was the discounted crisis rate but was still a rate they had not budgeted for. At the bottom of this entire system, invisible to the coverage that was focused on stranded tourists, with smartphones documenting their experience for social media, were the workers. The tens of thousands of migrant laborers operating under the kafala sponsorship system, which binds a worker's legal status in the country to their employer, he found themselves in a situation the system had no mechanism to address. Construction projects frozen by the crisis meant wages stopped. Wages stopping under the kafala system does not automatically mean the worker can leave, because leaving requires the employer's cooperation in releasing the visa, and employers facing their own financial distress were not prioritizing the paperwork. A worker earning between $300 and $500 a month does not have the cash reserve to absorb 2 or 3 weeks of unpaid suspension. They also do not have a ticket home they can charge to a corporate card. They have a bunk in a labor camp in Al Quoz and a phone with a family on the other end, asking when the next remittance is coming. This is the part that does not appear in the tourism board's response statements. The stranded tourist is a story about inconvenience and broken expectations, and, at its worst, genuine financial distress. The stranded worker is a story about something structurally different. It is a story about a system that was designed to extract value from human mobility while building no mechanism for what happens to the most vulnerable participants in that system when the mobility stops. The deeper problem that March 2026 exposed is not operational. Operations can be restored. Flights resume. Airports reopen. Insurance claims get processed eventually, even if slowly and incompletely. The deeper problem is architectural. Dubai constructed a city whose economic metabolism requires a constant and uninterrupted flow of external human beings. Not residents in the civic sense, people who have built their lives into the fabric of a place and whose presence does not depend on a return flight, but visitors and temporary workers and investors whose relationship with the city is transactional by design and by law. 90% of Dubai's population is non-national. That figure is frequently cited as evidence of the city's cosmopolitan appeal, its openness, its modernity. It is also a structural description of a city with almost no permanent base of demand. Every tourist who leaves and does not return is demand that evaporates. Every expatriate professional who recalculates the cost-benefit and moves to Lisbon or Singapore or back home is demand that disappears. Every investor who decides that the risk premium on Gulf real estate no longer justifies the yield is capital that relocates. And the city has always known this, and it has managed it by ensuring that the inflows consistently exceeded the outflows. March 2026 was the first time in the modern history of the Emirate that the outflows were not a matter of choice. Moody's had noted in its 2025 Gulf Credit Outlook that Dubai's real estate sector faced supply pressure from a projected 20% increase in residential inventory, much of it concentrated in the premium segment where demand is most sensitive to confidence and least sensitive to price. That report was read by analysts and largely ignored by the market, because markets ignore what they cannot immediately price. March 2026 gave the market a price. Dubai has recovered before. The population contraction of 2020 was followed by record-breaking inflows in 2021 and 2022. The government's capacity to deploy capital rapidly into stabilization measures is real and documented. The long-term infrastructure investments, including the expansion of Al Maktoum International into what is planned to be the world's largest airport by capacity, represent a genuine strategic bet on Dubai's continued centrality in global aviation. These are not illusions. They are real assets and real capabilities. But there is a difference between recovering operationally and recovering structurally. The flights will come back. The question is whether the confidence comes back at the same rate. A tourist who was stranded for 8 days in a transit zone with no clear information and a travel insurance policy that covered nothing useful does not become an ambassador for the destination. Getting an expatriate professional who watched colleagues scramble for exit options and spent a week uncertain about whether their employer could maintain payroll does not renew their lease with the same enthusiasm they brought when they arrived. An investor who watched property valuations move in ways that reflected sentiment rather than fundamentals, and who had assumed that sentiment in Dubai was a stable variable, has updated their model. Recovery of infrastructure is measured in weeks. Recovery of reputation is measured in years. And the two do not move on the same timeline, which means there is a period, potentially a long one, during which Dubai will be operationally open and reputationally questioned simultaneously. How the city manages that gap, whether it chooses transparency about what happened and structural changes to address the vulnerabilities that March exposed, or whether it returns to the promotional narrative that served it well during a period when nothing had tested it seriously, is the decision that will define what kind of city Dubai becomes in the decade ahead. The airport will reopen at full capacity. The lounges will fill again. The connection times will tighten back to the 50-minute minimum that makes the hub model work. But the people who lived through those days in Terminal 3 on the floor with their luggage and their dead phone batteries and their travel insurance exclusion clauses, they have already left with a different understanding of what Dubai actually is. Not the brochure, not the record passenger numbers, the actual place. It's a place where the miracle of frictionless movement turns out to have been, all along, contingent on a set of conditions that nobody had fully modeled, because nobody had needed to, until they did. If you have been through Dubai in the last few months, as a traveler, as a resident, or as someone who had a flight canceled and spent days trying to figure out what came next, I want to hear what that experience actually looked like from where you were standing. And if this kind of analysis is what you come here for, you already know what to do.